The pressure gauge on bulkhead 9 had been reading 4% high for 11 days, and Chief Damage Control Officer Tessa Rourke had written it up every single one of them. She stood in the main engineering gallery of the Kethara deep extraction platform Anishval, watching the gauge through the scratched faceplate of her hardsuit helmet, and she did not like what she saw. Not the 4%. 4% was a maintenance note. What she did not like was the pattern behind it. The gauge had read 2% high on day 1, 3% on day 5, 4% on day 8. The number was climbing in a curve, not a line, and curves in pressure systems meant something downstream was compressing, something upstream was failing to compensate, and the margin between those two facts was shrinking on a schedule that nobody on this station seemed interested in reading. She pulled up her datapad and logged the entry. The 11th consecutive daily log noting anomalous pressure behavior in Bulkhead 9, Cross Gallery 7, Extraction Tier 4, flagged for review, forwarded to the Kethara station engineers, acknowledged by none of them. The Kethara did not acknowledge human maintenance logs. They acknowledged human presence the way a factory acknowledges a replacement part useful in its socket, irrelevant outside it. Rourke and the 11 other humans aboard Anishval were contract damage control technicians, hired through the Terran Merchant Engineering Corps, because the Kethara Extraction Guild couldn't find enough of their own species willing to work the deep pressure tiers. The contract was 18 months. The pay was excellent. The living quarters were adequate, a sealed section on Tier 2, self-contained with its own atmospheric mix, its own galley, its own recycler, separated from the Kethara crew areas by an airlock that might as well have been a border crossing. The Kethara breathed a different gas ratio, ate different nutrients, operated on a different circadian cycle. The separation was practical. The attitude behind it was not. The respect was non-existent. It had been that way since the humans arrived. The Kethara were an insectoid species, chitinous, segmented, their bodies encased in hard amber-brown exoskeletons that clicked when they moved and hummed at frequencies below human hearing when they communicated in close quarters. Their faces were arrangements of compound eyes, articulated mandibles, and sensory palps that moved in constant subtle patterns, reading vibrations in the air the way humans read facial expressions. They were efficient, hierarchical, and profoundly uninterested in any species that couldn't feel the subsonic registers of their language. Platform Director Sovith Ka had made the position clear on the humans' first day. The translation hadn't softened it. You are here because the deep tiers require hands we would rather not risk. You will maintain. You will repair. You will not advise. The Kethara Extraction Guild has operated deep-pressure platforms for 900 years. Human engineering opinions are not required. Rourke had nodded, logged the statement, and started walking the platform every morning at 400, the same way she'd walked every platform, every station, every ship she'd ever served on in 23 years of damage control work. It was a habit she'd inherited from her father, who'd spent 30 years on deep-water oil platforms in the North Sea, steel-end concrete structures anchored to the ocean floor, surrounded by water that would kill you in 9 minutes and pressure systems that would kill you faster if you stopped paying attention. He'd walked his rigs every morning before dawn, coffee in one hand, clipboard in the other, checking everything that mattered and several things that didn't, because the thing that killed you was the thing you decided wasn't worth checking. He died at 58, heart attack at home in a recliner watching television, not on the rig. The rig never got him because he never stopped walking it. Rourke had the same habits and the same stubbornness, and her crew suspected the same intention to die of something boring after a career spent keeping other people alive in places designed to kill them. She checked every gauge, every seal, every pressure junction, every thermal coupling in the 9 tiers she was responsible for, because the fact that nobody wanted her opinion didn't change the fact that she had one. The Anishval was the largest deep extraction platform in the Cathara Guild's active fleet, a 9-tier industrial structure anchored in geosynchronous orbit above a mineral-rich planetary body, its extraction systems reaching down through the atmosphere and into the compressed geological strata below. 340 Cathara worked aboard in rotating shifts, operating the extraction, processing, and containment systems that were the Guild's primary source of revenue and the cornerstone of their interstellar economy. The platform ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it had run that way for 11 years without a significant incident. The Guild's safety record was, by any measure, extraordinary. And it had made them complacent in the specific way that an extraordinary safety record always makes people complacent, not by making them careless, but by making them certain. This morning, day 11 of the pressure anomaly, she finished the gauge log, tucked the datapad against her hip, and walked the rest of her route. Cross Gallery 7 ran along the platform's lower extraction tier, a corridor of welded Cathara alloy and reinforced composite that hummed with the deep vibration of the drilling systems 3 tiers below. The walls were warm. They were always warm down here. The extraction process pulled superheated material from a planetary body's compressed interior, channeled it through cooling stages, and stored it in containment cells that lined the platform's midsection like organs in a body. The warmth was normal. The warmth was the platform working. What was not normal was the condensation on the coupling joints at junction K714. Rourke stopped. She ran her gloved fingers across the joint. Moisture, thin, metallic smelling with a faint iridescence that meant it wasn't water. It was coolant. Micro-seepage from the secondary cooling loop, weeping through a joint that should have been dry. She pulled up the junction's maintenance history, last inspected by a Cathara engineer 41 days ago. Status: nominal, no recheck scheduled. Rourke knelt and pressed her palm flat against the pipe below the joint. The vibration was wrong. Not louder, not softer. Wrong, a frequency she couldn't name but could feel in her wrist bones, the kind of vibration that meant 2 systems were interacting in a way the designers hadn't intended. She marked the junction, logged the seepage, flagged it urgent, and sent it to the Cathara engineering deck. The acknowledgement that came back 12 minutes later was a single character in the Cathara administrative script. Translation: noted. Not reviewed, not scheduled, noted. Rourke walked back to the human quarters on Tier 2 and sat down across from Lieutenant Pavan Dihar, her second-in-command, who was eating reconstituted eggs and reading a structural analysis on his tablet. "The pressure curve on bulkhead 9 is steepening," she said, "and I found coolant seepage on the K714 coupling. The secondary loop is losing integrity." Dihar looked up. He was a quiet man, compact, dark-eyed, with the kind of stillness that came from 12 years of working in spaces where a wrong step meant decompression. "Did you flag it?" 11 times for the pressure, once for the seepage, today. "And noted." Dihar set down his fork. "The secondary cooling loop feeds the extraction containment cells. If it loses integrity, while the extraction system is running at full draw, I know what happens." They looked at each other. They both knew. A cooling failure during full extraction meant the containment cells would lose thermal regulation. Superheated material in a containment cell without cooling didn't explode. It did something worse. It expanded, slowly, relentlessly, pushing against the cell walls with pressure that increased geometrically as the temperature rose, until the cell wall yielded and the material 3,000 degrees, pressurized, corrosive, found the path of least resistance into the surrounding structure. It wouldn't happen all at once. It would happen in stages, one cell, then the next, then the next. A cascade, each failure feeding the conditions for the next, each breach widening the damage radius, each tier compromised feeding heat and pressure into the tier above it. The platform wouldn't explode. It would eat itself from the inside out. How long? Dihar asked. If the curve holds, the pressure anomaly crosses critical in maybe 36 hours. If the seepage accelerates and the secondary loop drops below minimum flow, the containment cells start losing thermal margin inside of 12. We should go to Sovath Ka directly. I've sent 11 reports. In person, on the command deck, with the data in front of their face. Rourke hesitated. Walking onto the Kethara command deck uninvited was a protocol violation under the Guild Charter. Humans did not enter command spaces. Humans stayed in the tiers they were assigned, filed their reports, and waited for instructions. That was the contract. That was the arrangement. Get dressed, Rourke said. Bring everything. Dihar pushed his plate away. You know they'll throw us out. Probably. And if they don't throw us out, they'll tell us we're wrong and send us back down. Also probable. And you're going anyway. Rourke picked up Dihar's unfinished eggs and scraped them into the recycler. Pavin, I've been walking these tiers for 11 months. I know every pipe, every junction, every seal point on this platform better than I know my own apartment. I've watched the pressure trend steepen day by day, and I've sent report after report up a chain that ends in a single character that means, we heard you and we don't care. I have exhausted the procedures that are available to me. What I have not exhausted is my capacity to be a pain in the ass. Dihar almost smiled. That is, in fact, inexhaustible. So I've been told. They went to the command deck at 6:20. Sovath Ka was there, surrounded by 6 senior Kethara engineers in the amber-lit workspace that served as the platform's nerve center. Holographic displays showed extraction rates, pressure maps, containment cell status, drilling depth, everything nominal, everything green. The Kethara hummed at subsonic frequencies as they worked, the sound filling the space like a low electric current, and when Rourke and Dihar stepped through the hatch, the humming stopped. Every compound eye in the room turned toward them. Sovath Ka's mandibles clicked. You are not scheduled for this deck. Director Sovath Ka, I'm requesting an emergency engineering review of the secondary cooling loop and the pressure trend on bulkhead 9. Rourke held out her datapad. I have 11 days of data showing a steepening pressure curve in extraction tier 4 and coolant seepage at junction K714 that indicates progressive seal failure in the secondary loop. If the loop drops below minimum flow during full extraction, the containment cells will lose thermal regulation and begin a cascading breach. Sovath Ka's palps moved, a subtle, rapid pattern that Rourke couldn't read but the other Kethara could. 2 of the senior engineers turned back to their displays. One made a sound that the translator rendered as a dismissive click. Chief Rourke, the extraction system on this platform has operated at full capacity for 11 years without a containment breach. The secondary cooling loop was designed with triple redundancy by Kethara engineers who have been building deep pressure systems since before your species achieved powered flight. Your pressure readings fall within the acceptable variance band defined by Guild standards. The mandibles clicked again. Your concern is noted. Return to your assigned tier. Rourke didn't move. Director, the variance band was calculated for linear drift. This curve is exponential, the rate of change. I said return to your tier, Chief. The subsonic humming resumed. Louder. A wall of sound that pressed against Rourke's chest and made Dihar take a half step back. The Kethara did not raise their voices. They lowered them into frequencies that human bodies felt as pressure, as weight, as the visceral sensation of being pushed. Rourke stood her ground for 3 seconds. Then she nodded, turned, and left. In the corridor outside, Dihar exhaled. So we prep. For what? For what happens when I'm right. They spent the rest of the day preparing. Quietly, without authorization, without telling anyone on the Cathara engineering staff, because telling them would mean another noted and another wall of subsonic dismissal. Rourke pulled her full team together, all 12 humans. Dihar, Akafar, the structural specialist who'd spent 6 years on orbital construction rigs and could read a load-bearing column the way a doctor reads an X-ray. Brennan and Toussaint, the 2 junior damage control techs who trained together at the Fleet Academy and finished each other's sentences during drills. Kim, who handled atmospheric systems with the quiet obsessiveness of someone who understood that air was the thing that killed you fastest when it left. Patel, who knew more about thermal regulation than anyone on the platform, including the Cathara, and who had invented 3 field techniques that no manual had ever documented because nobody with a manual had ever needed them on a rig that wasn't actively trying to kill its crew. Vasquez, Driscoll, Tanaka, Chen, and Morrow, the remaining 5. Welders, cutters, SEAL specialists, the people who fixed things that broke in places nobody wanted to go. She briefed them in the human mess at 1900. No datapad, no formal presentation. She stood at the head of the table and told them what she saw, what the numbers said, and what was going to happen if the numbers were right. I could be wrong, she said. The Cathara have been doing this for 900 years. They know their systems, they know their materials, they know their margins, and they think I'm wrong. But you're not, Akafar said, not a question. I've been wrong before. I've never been wrong 11 days in a row. What do you need? Contingency plans. Every SEAL point on tiers 3 through 7 mapped and marked with emergency closure procedures. Portable containment barriers fabricated from stock in the human equipment locker. We've got enough composite sheeting and thermal insulation to build 8. Atmospheric isolation protocols for every section we can reach. Evacuation routes plotted for both human and Cathara crew, primary and secondary. Because if this goes the way I think, the primary routes on Tier 4 will be compromised within the first 20 minutes. And I need all of it done by tomorrow evening. Without Cathara authorization, Brennan said. Without Cathara authorization. Silence. 12 humans in a mess hall on a station run by a species that considered them replacement parts, being asked to prepare for a disaster their hosts insisted was impossible. There are 340 Cathara on this platform, Rourke said, plus us. If I'm wrong, we've wasted a day on drills. If I'm right and we're not ready, people die. People meaning bugs who think we're furniture, Brennan said, not with malice, with the flat accuracy of someone stating conditions. People meaning 352 living beings on a station I'm responsible for. Rourke's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I signed a contract to maintain this platform. The contract doesn't say I stop caring about the crew when the crew stops caring about me. Brennan held her gaze for a long moment, then he nodded. Where do you want me? They worked through the night. Akafar mapped every structural seal point on tiers 3 through 7, crawling through access shafts with a handheld sonic mapper, cataloging 214 potential isolation points, and marking the 31 most critical with luminescent tape that would glow in emergency lighting. Brennan and Toussaint fabricated 8 portable containment barriers from composite sheeting, thermal insulation blankets, and the metal framing from 2 unused equipment racks, cutting and welding in the human workshop on Tier 2 with the door closed so the Cathara night shift wouldn't hear the torch. Kim wrote atmospheric isolation protocols for every section she could reach without entering Cathara-restricted spaces, and for 6 sections she couldn't reach but planned anyway if the situation demanded it. Patel ran thermal failure simulations on her tablet, modeling 16 different cascade scenarios and calculating the intervention windows for each one. The narrowest window was 11 minutes. The widest was 40. Dihar coordinated. He moved between the teams with the calm, steady cadence of a man who had been preparing for emergencies his entire career, and who understood that the preparation was the part that saved lives. The event itself was just the test of whether you'd prepared well enough. Vasquez and Driscoll spent 4 hours mapping the evacuation route's primary corridors on each tier, secondary shafts and maintenance tunnels that could serve as alternatives if the primaries were compromised. They walked every route themselves, measuring clearances, checking door actuators, marking the 3 emergency airlocks on tiers 3, 5, and 7 with the luminescent tape from Acafer's supply. At 100, Vasquez found a secondary egress on Tier 4 that had been sealed from the outside by a Cathara maintenance crew during a routine pipe replacement 6 months earlier. The seal was a single bolt, hand-tightened. Vasquez removed it, tested the door, replaced the bolt loosely enough to turn by hand in an emergency, and logged the modification in his notebook. Nobody asked him to. Nobody would know he had done it unless the route was needed. He did it because Tessa Rourke had taught him, in 15 years of serving on rigs and stations and ships together, that the evacuation route you didn't check was the one that killed people. Tanaka, Chen, and Morrow inventoried every firefighting and emergency tool in the human equipment locker, and staged them at 3 preposition points along the Tier 3-4 boundary. Portable extinguishers, thermal blankets, 2 extra torque multipliers, pry bars, a portable atmospheric analyzer, 4 emergency breathing kits compatible with Cathara respiratory physiology that Rourke had requisitioned on day 1 and never been thanked for, and the one item Rourke had brought aboard in her personal kit, a 60-year-old hand-cranked emergency radio that ran on no power source except human muscle. It had belonged to her father. He'd been a damage control officer too, on deep-water oil platforms in the North Sea, and the radio had saved his crew twice when the digital systems failed. She'd carried it on every posting since his death. It had never been needed. She staged it at the Tier 3 junction anyway. By 300, they were ready. Or as ready as 12 people could be for a disaster that 340 others didn't believe was coming. The human workshop smelled of welding flux and composite adhesive, the air scrubbers working overtime to clear the fumes from 6 hours of fabrication. The evacuation maps were taped to the wall of the common area, hand-drawn by Vasquez on thermal sheeting, with color-coded routes for each tier and notations in both standard English and the basic Cathara, directional symbols that Tanaka had memorized from the platform's safety placards. They wouldn't be able to communicate with the Cathara through speech in a crisis. The translators were slow. The subsonic channels were inaccessible to human vocal cords, but they could point, gesture, and if necessary, physically guide 340 beings who had never once practiced a cross-species evacuation drill. Rourke walked the human quarters one final time, checking that every team member had their hardsuit accessible, their kit packed, their comms channels set. She found Patel still awake in the common area, running one more simulation on her tablet, the screen's glow casting blue shadows across her face. Scenario 7, Patel said without looking up. Loop-fed cascade with secondary system propagation. That's the one that matches your data best. Intervention window is 26 minutes from the first cell breach to Tier 3 involvement. She looked up. 26 minutes to close 14 valves, Rourke. That's less than 2 minutes per valve, assuming we can get to all of them, assuming nothing else goes wrong. Something else will go wrong. Yes, it always does, Patel set down the tablet. I've run 16 scenarios. In 11 of them, we save the platform. In 3, we lose Tier 4 but save everything above it. In 2, she stopped. In 2, we don't get there in time. In 2, nobody gets out. Rourke sat down across from her. Which scenario do you think we're in? Patel considered the question with the seriousness of a woman who understood that the difference between simulation and reality was the part you couldn't model, the human part, the part that decided to go back into a burning corridor for one more valve. I think we're in whichever one we choose to be in, she said. The variables I can't model are the ones wearing hardsuits. Rourke nodded. Get some sleep. You first. Neither of them slept. The cascade began at 3:47. Rourke was in her bunk when the first alarm sounded, not the standard maintenance tone she'd been hearing for 11 days, but the deep, bone-shaking pulse of a Cathara emergency klaxon. She was dressed and moving before the second pulse, hardsuit sealed, helmet locked, datapad live with the platform's sensor net feeding real-time data as she ran. Containment cell 14 had breached. The cell wall had yielded along a thermal stress fracture that ran exactly where her pressure model had predicted, and superheated extraction material was flooding into the surrounding structure at 3,000 degrees. The secondary cooling loop, the one she'd flagged 11 times, had dropped below minimum flow 18 minutes before the breach, exactly as she'd calculated. And nobody had noticed because the Cathara monitoring system classified the flow drop as within acceptable variance. Rourke hit the command channel. All human DC teams, this is Rourke. Cascade event initiated. Containment cell 14 breached. Execute contingency protocols. Brennan, Towsink Tier 4 isolation barriers now, positions Alpha through Delta. ACA for structural assessment. I need load-bearing status on tiers 3 through 6 in real time. Kim, atmospheric isolation. Start sealing everything below tier 3. Patel, thermal modeling. Which scenario are we in? Dihar, you're with me. We're going to the breach. 11 responses came back in 9 seconds. Every one of them had been awake. Every one of them had been suited or within arm's reach of a suit. They had been waiting for the alarm the way soldiers wait for the sound they've been told is coming, not hoping for it, not dreading it, just ready. Brennan and Towsink were already moving toward the prepositioned barriers on the Tier 3-4 boundary, pulling them from the staging points where Tanaka and Chen had placed them 6 hours earlier. Akafer had his structural analysis tablet live before the second klaxon pulse, cross-referencing the breach location against his map of 214 seal points. Kim was sealing atmospheric boundaries by the third pulse, working through the isolation protocols she'd written in the human common area, while everyone else was fabricating barriers and mapping crawlways. Patel had Scenario 7 loaded and running before Rourke finished her orders, the thermal model updating in real time as the platform's sensor net fed breach data into her calculations. Rourke, Dihar's voice was controlled. The breach is on Tier 4. That's Cathara engineering territory. We don't have authorization. Authorization is burning. Move. They moved. The platform's corridors were filling with Cathara personnel streaming toward their emergency stations, organized, subsonic commands rippling through the crowd in frequencies Rourke could feel but not hear. She pushed through them, her hardsuit bulkier than their compact, armored bodies, her movement drawing stares from compound eyes that had spent 11 months looking past her. Now they looked at her. At the human running toward the disaster instead of away from it, carrying tools instead of evacuation bags, heading down instead of up. The platform was waking into chaos. Cathara crew scrambled through corridors in organized clusters, their chitinous bodies moving with the segmented precision of their species, fast, coordinated, driven by subsonic signals that humans couldn't hear. But the coordination had gaps. The Cathara emergency protocols were designed for single-point failures, not cascades. Their training assumed that a containment breach would be isolated by the triple redundant systems surrounding every cell. The protocols didn't account for the scenario where the redundancy itself had failed, where the secondary cooling loop that was supposed to catch the primary failure was already compromised, where the backup feeding the backup was deteriorating through the same junction that had been seeping coolant for 2 weeks. Rourke saw the failure pattern unfolding in real time. Cell 14 was breaching into the structural cavity between tiers 4 and 5. The superheated material was following the path of least resistance, the coolant channels of the now empty secondary loop, which ran like arteries through the platform's body, connecting cell to cell to cell. The material was using the very system designed to cool it as a highway to the next containment cell. Cell 15's temperature spiked. Cell 16 followed 40 seconds later. Patel, which scenario? Patel's voice came back fast. Scenario 7. Loop-fed cascade with secondary system propagation. Intervention window, 26 minutes from the first cell breach to Tier 3 involvement. We've used 8 of those minutes. We have 18 left. Soveth Ka. Rourke opened the command channel to the Cathara director. This is Chief Rourke. You have a cascade in progress. The secondary cooling loop is acting as a conduit for the breach material. You need to sever the loop connections between cells manually, or you'll lose the entire Tier 4 containment bank. Silence. Then Soveth Ka's voice translated flat. We are aware of the breach. Our engineering teams are responding. Your engineering teams are responding to a single-cell breach protocol. This is a cascade. The loop connections. Return to your assigned tier, Chief. This is a Cathara engineering matter. The channel cut. Rourke looked at Dihar. Dihar looked back. Between them, the data on her pad showed cell 17 beginning to heat. They're going to lose the whole tier, Dihar said quietly. Not if we get there first. They reached Tier 4 through an access shaft. The Cathara engineers rarely used a maintenance crawlway that ran vertically between the tiers. Too narrow for the broad, segmented Cathara bodies, but precisely the right size for human shoulders. Rourke went first, dropping into the shaft and descending hand over hand, the heat rising around her with every meter. Her hardsuit's thermal layer held, but she could feel the temperature gradient pressing through, warm at the top, hot at the middle, furnace at the bottom. She emerged into Cross Gallery 7, the same corridor she'd walked that morning, checking gauges, logging anomalies being ignored. Now it was transformed. The walls glowed with transmitted heat, the Cathara alloy radiating stored thermal energy in visible waves that distorted the air like the shimmer above asphalt on a summer highway. The emergency lighting had switched to the deep amber that the Cathara visual spectrum processed most efficiently in crisis conditions, a frequency that humans perceived as dim and oppressive, turning the corridor into something that looked like the inside of a furnace even before you felt the temperature. Junction K714. The coupling where she'd found the coolant seepage had blown entirely, and a stream of superheated material was pouring through the ruptured joint in a sluggish, incandescent river that pooled on the deck and ate into the floor plating with a sound like fat on a griddle. The material was bright, not white-hot, but a deep, viscous orange that pulsed with its own internal energy, moving with the thick slowness of lava, but carrying a heat signature that Rourke's suit sensors read as 2800 degrees at the flow edge. Hot enough to soften structural alloy. Hot enough to burn through a standard hardsuit in 11 seconds. Hot enough that the air above it danced. 2 Cathara engineers were in the gallery, their amber exoskeletons darkened with heat stress, mandibles working rapidly as they tried to operate a manual isolation valve on the coolant loop. The valve wasn't responding. The heat had warped the valve stem, and the Cathara's broad, chitinous hands, powerful but designed for large grip manipulation, couldn't get the purchase needed to force the warped mechanism. Rourke was beside them in 4 seconds. She pulled a torque multiplier from her kit, a tool she'd carried every day for 11 months, never once asked to use it, slotted it onto the valve stem, and threw her weight against it. The valve didn't move. She adjusted the angle, braced her boots against the base plate, and pulled again. The metal screamed. The valve turned 1/4 rotation, then jammed. Dihar on the handle, both hands. Dihar grabbed the multiplier alongside her. 2 humans, combined weight 160 kilograms, hauling on a tool designed for exactly this kind of failure, against a valve manufactured to be operated by Cathara grips that couldn't manage it now. The valve turned, 1/4, 1/2, 3/4, full isolation. The flow of superheated material through the ruptured junction slowed, stuttered, and stopped. The river on the deck continued to glow, but it was no longer being fed. The two Kethara engineers stared. Their compound eyes tracked Rourke's hands on the tool, Dihar's hands beside hers, the valve stem now seated in its closed position. Their mandibles moved in a pattern Rourke had never seen, rapid, uncertain, a vibration that the translator couldn't parse. "Cell 14 is still breaching," Rourke said. 15 and 16 are compromised. We need to isolate every loop connection manually before the cascade reaches the Tier 3 containment bank. How many manual isolation valves on this tier? The taller Kethara engineer answered. The translator rendered it flat. 14. 14 valves, 18 minutes of window. Rourke did the math. We need every hand we can get. How many of your people can get down here? The access corridors are compromised. Heat has sealed the primary routes. Our teams are attempting to breach from Tier 3 above, but the structural barriers. The maintenance shaft, the vertical crawlway between Tiers 3 and 4. It's clear. Your junior engineers can fit if they fold their secondary limbs. The Kethara's palps moved. That crawlway has not been used in 6 years. It is not part of our emergency procedures. It's clear. I climbed down it 3 minutes ago. Call your junior teams. The engineer looked at its companion. A rapid subsonic exchange that Rourke felt in her sternum rather than heard. Then, we will call them. Call them fast. Dihar channel to Brennan. I need the portable barriers routed to Tier 4 through the crawlway 2 at a time. Tell Kim to seal Tier 3 atmospheric boundaries. If we lose this tier entirely, the heat doesn't reach the upper platform. And tell Patel to update the model. We've closed one valve, 13 to go, and the window is shrinking. Patel's updated model came back in 90 seconds. Valve 1 closed buys you 4 additional minutes on the east bank. But cells 15 and 16 are feeding each other through a cross-connection the original model didn't account for. You have a secondary cascade forming within the primary cascade. If you don't isolate valves 3 and 4, that's the east bank cross-connect before the west bank cells start heating. You lose both banks simultaneously. Prioritize 3 and 4. Dihar, you take 3, I'll take 4. They split. The decision was instinctive. They had worked together long enough that the division of labor required no discussion. Dihar was methodical, precise, the kind of engineer who approached every problem as a sequence of steps to be executed in order. Rourke was faster, more intuitive, willing to improvise when the procedures ran out. In a normal operation, Dihar's method was better. In a cascade with a shrinking window, Rourke's speed was what mattered. She took the harder valve because she could get to it faster, and Dihar took the closer valve because he would close it right the first time. And between them they would cover both before the secondary cascade consumed the margin they'd just bought. Rourke moved down cross gallery 7 alone, the corridor narrowing where thermal expansion had bowed the walls inward. The floor was soft under her boots, not melting, but approaching the plasticity threshold of the alloy, the temperature high enough to compromise the structural integrity of the walking surface itself. She tested each step before committing her weight, feeling for the subtle give that would mean the deck was about to fail. Valve 4 was behind a wall panel that had fused shut. Rourke pulled her pry bar, another tool she carried daily, another tool no one had ever asked her to use, and worked the panel's edge. The alloy resisted, then yielded with a sharp crack that sent a shower of heated particulate across her visor. Behind the panel, the valve was intact but half buried in a mass of coolant that had leaked, congealed, and hardened into a glassy crust around the stem. She chipped at the crust with the pry bar, piece by piece. The congealed coolant fractured in angular shards that scattered across the deck like broken amber. 3 minutes to clear the stem. She slotted the torque multiplier, braced and pulled. Alone this time. No Dihar. 160 pounds of human against a valve designed for Cathara torque specifications. The valve moved, barely. She adjusted her footing, found a pipe bracket she could hook her boot against for leverage, and pulled again. Her shoulder burned. The gauntlet seal on her left hand, the one she'd been meaning to replace for 3 weeks, compressed under the load, and she felt the first whisper of heat against her palm. The valve turned, seated, sealed. "Valve 4 closed," she said into the channel. "Valve 3 closed," Dihar reported from 40 meters away. "East Bank cross-connect is isolated." Patel's voice: "Cross-connect severed. Secondary cascade within the primary is contained." "You bought the West Bank another 8 minutes. Total remaining window to Tier 3 involvement, 14 minutes, 11 valves." 14 minutes, 11 valves. 2 humans and whatever Cathara engineers could fit through a crawlway that hadn't been used in 6 years. The first Cathara junior engineers arrived 4 minutes later, 7 of them, smaller than the senior staff, their chitin still carrying the slightly translucent quality of youth. They came down the crawlway with their secondary limbs folded tight against their thoraxes, moving with a clicking urgency that needed no translation. Behind them came Brennan and Tausink, hauling the first 2 portable containment barriers. Rourke organized them without hesitation. Each valve got a team, 1 human with the torque multiplier and the pry bar, 1 or 2 Cathara who knew where the valves were located and could identify the ancillary systems that needed to be cleared before the valve could be accessed. The language barrier dissolved in the grammar of emergency. Point at the valve, clear the debris, brace the tool, pull. Valve 5, Brennan and a Cathara named Seth Rival, who held the wall panel steady while Brennan cut away the thermal-warped framing with a plasma cutter. The valve stem was bent. Brennan straightened it with 2 precise hammer strikes, a technique his instructor at the Fleet Academy had called persuasion engineering, and forced it closed. Valve 6, Tausink, working in a section where the atmospheric pressure had dropped to 60%. Her hardsuit compensated, but the Cathara working alongside her had no suit. The Cathara didn't have emergency pressure suits because their exoskeletons served that function under normal conditions. But these were not normal conditions. The pressure differential was pulling gas from the Cathara's spherical vents, the breathing ports along its thorax, faster than its respiratory system could compensate. Its movements were sluggish, its mandibles working in slow, labored patterns that Tausink recognized from her emergency biology training as the early signs of hypoxic distress. She sealed the valve in 90 seconds, then turned and guided the Cathara back toward higher pressure sections with a hand on its thorax, walking slowly, matching its pace. At the pressure boundary, 2 more Cathara met them, drawn by the subsonic distress signal their colleague had been emitting at a frequency Tausink couldn't hear, but they could. They took their crewmate without a word. One of them looked at Tausink. Its compound eyes tracked from her helmet to her gloved hand, the hand still resting on their colleague's thorax, and its mandibles moved in a pattern the translator couldn't parse. Then it dipped its head. A small, fast gesture, not Cathara protocol, something else. Between valves, Rourke got a report from Kim on Tier 3. "I've sealed the atmospheric boundaries on Sections 3 Alpha through 3 Echo, but there's a problem. Section 3 Foxtrot has 47 Cathara workers in it, a full extraction monitoring shift. The section's ventilation feeds from Tier 4. When I sealed the boundary, I cut off their fresh air supply. They've got about 90 minutes of breathable atmosphere in the sealed volume before CO2 levels become dangerous." "Can you reroute ventilation from Tier 2? "Already working on it. The ductwork doesn't connect, different system design. I'm going to have to cut a hole in the Tier 2 floor, drop a flexible duct, and patch it into the 3 Foxtrot intake. It's ugly. It's not in any schematic. And I need Cathara cooperation on the 3 Foxtrot side to open their intake manifold." "Do they know they're running out of air?" "They know. One of their senior techs is at the sealed boundary door, signaling through the viewport. I can't read the mandible patterns, but the urgency is obvious. Get the duct in. Tanaka, go help Kim. Take a cutting tool and a translation pad, tell them to open their intake manifold from inside. We'll feed them air from Tier 2. The Tier 2 air will be human standard mix, Tanaka said. Cathara breathe a different nitrogen ratio. It's closer to what they need than no air at all. Move. Tanaka moved. The duct was cut, dropped, and patched in 22 minutes. The Cathara tech on the other side of the sealed door opened the intake manifold when Tanaka held the translation pad to the viewport and displayed the atmospheric symbol for clean air incoming. The air that flowed through was human standard, slightly wrong for Cathara biology, slightly rich in oxygen, slightly lean in the heavier gases their spiracles preferred. But it was breathable. 47 Cathara workers continued breathing in Section 3 Foxtrot because a human atmospheric specialist cut a hole in a floor she wasn't authorized to touch and fed them air from a species whose atmosphere they'd never bothered to study. Back on Tier 4. Valve 7, Rourke alone again. The section was too hot for the Cathara juniors. Their exoskeletons began to delaminate above certain temperatures, the outer layer cracking and peeling in a way that was not immediately dangerous but was excruciating, their palps registering pain at frequencies that made the nearby Cathara flinch even through walls. Rourke went in, closed the valve in 4 minutes, came out with new burns forming beneath her degraded left gauntlet. Valve 8, Dihar and 2 Cathara juniors. Clean access. 30 seconds to clear, 90 seconds to close. The fastest one yet. The Cathara juniors clicked at each other when it seeded a sharp, high-frequency sound that the translator couldn't render, but that sounded to Dihar's ears like triumph. Valve 9, Vasquez and Driscoll, who had come down the crawlway with the second pair of containment barriers and immediately joined the isolation effort. The valve was submerged in a pool of cooling superheated material that had to be diverted before anyone could reach the stem. Vasquez used a portable barrier as a dam, leaning it against the gallery wall at an angle to channel the material away from the valve access point, while Driscoll reached through the gap and worked the multiplier. The dam held. The valve closed. Patel's voice on the channel, tracking. 9 down, 5 to go. West Bank cells are holding. Temperature in cell 20 is rising but within containable range if you close valve 11 in the next 3 minutes. Cell 20 is the bridge to Tier 3. At valve 9, a second complication emerged. Patel's voice cut across the channel with the flat urgency of a woman reading data she didn't like. Rourke, cell 22 is spiking, independent of the loop cascade. This is a separate fault, a microfracture in the cooling jacket that's been there for months, invisible under normal thermal loads. The ambient temperature from the breached cells is pushing the surrounding structure past the threshold where that fracture becomes a macro failure. Can we patch it? I can see the fracture on my thermals. If I can get to the external access panel on the cooling jacket, I can apply a thermal bridge, seal the fracture from outside, redirect the cooling flow around the break. How long? 20 minutes. Maybe less if somebody holds the lamp and doesn't ask questions I don't have time to answer. Vasquez, go with Patel. You're the lamp. Move. Patel and Vasquez reached cell 22's external access panel through a crawlspace between the cell housing and the outer hull, a maintenance gap 40 centimeters wide that required removing their suits' shoulder assemblies to fit through. Patel went in on her back with her toolkit balanced on her chest, the ceiling so close that her faceplate fogged where her breath hit the metal above. The fracture was visible as a dark line across the cooling jacket's surface, thin, barely wider than a hair, but leaking cold-side coolant in a fine mist that had already formed ice crystals on the surrounding metal. In normal operations, harmless. Under the current thermal load, growing. She applied a thermal bridge, a technique she developed on a helium-3 mining rig in the asteroid belt 6 years ago, layering a conductive compound across the fracture in alternating bands to reroute the cooling flow around the break. It was considered too unorthodox for guild-certified operations. It had never been written up in any manual. It worked every time she used it. The patch held. Cell 22's temperature peaked 12 degrees below catastrophic failure, hovered for 41 seconds, and began to descend. 22 is stable, Patel reported. Patch is holding, you're clear. Valve 10. Tanaka and a Kethara engineer who had been working in the adjacent section when the cascade began and had stayed, alone, trying to manually close valves with bare chitin hands for 20 minutes before the humans arrived. The engineer's hands were cracked deep fissures in the exoskeleton where the heat and the torque had exceeded what the material could bear. It had kept trying. Tanaka closed the valve while the engineer watched, its damaged hands held against its thorax, its compound eyes following every movement of the human's tool with an intensity that went beyond professional observation. Valve 11, the critical one, the bridge to Tier 3. Rourke took it herself. The valve was at the end of a corridor that had partially collapsed. Ceiling panels hung at angles, supported by bent framing that could give way at any moment. The floor was buckled, creating ridges and troughs that made walking treacherous. The heat was extreme. Rourke's suit temperature reading climbed past every threshold she'd ever worked in. The gauntlet seal on her left hand had degraded further, and she could feel the heat directly on her palm now, not as warmth but as pain. The kind of progressive, insistent pain that damage control officers learned to classify and set aside because the work didn't stop when you hurt. She reached the valve. It was intact. The stem was straight. The access was clear. For once, the machinery cooperated. She slotted the multiplier, braced, and pulled. The valve turned smoothly, almost easily, as if the universe had decided to grant one small mercy at the end of a corridor of compounding disasters. Valve 11 closed. Tier 3 bridge is sealed. She leaned against the corridor wall. The heat was pressing through her suit in waves, and her left hand had gone from pain to numbness, which was worse because numbness meant the burns had gone deep enough to affect the nerve endings. She flexed her fingers inside the degraded gauntlet. 3 of them responded. 2 didn't. She filed the information, categorized it as later, and pushed off the wall. Patel's response was immediate. Tier 3 is safe. The cascade is contained to Tier 4. Cells 14 through 16 are fully breached. 17 and 18 are compromised but cooling. 19 through 26 are holding. Repeat, the cascade is contained. On the command channel, somebody breathed out. Rourke couldn't tell if it was human or Kethara. It didn't matter. The sound meant the same thing in any species. Valves 12, 13, and 14 were closed in the next 11 minutes by mixed teams that no longer bothered to check authorization protocols. At Valve 12, a Kethara senior engineer, one of the 6 who had been on the command deck when Rourke was dismissed that morning, appeared in the corridor. Its amber exoskeleton was heat-darkened, its mandibles still. It looked at the human Kethara team working the valve and joined without a word. It braced the wall panel while Driscoll worked the multiplier, its broad, chitinous hands holding the alloy steady with a grip strength that no human could match, absorbing the vibration of the warped mechanism so that Driscoll could make fine adjustments to the tool angle. They closed the valve in under a minute. The senior engineer's compound eyes held on Driscoll's face for 2 seconds afterward, and its palps moved once, a single, short vibration. The translator didn't render it. Driscoll nodded anyway. At Valve 13, Morrow and Chen worked alongside 3 Kethara juniors in a section where the gravity plating had failed. The artificial gravity generators on Tier 4 drew power from the containment bank, and with 3 cells breached, the local field had collapsed to approximately 15% of standard. Every step was a controlled float. Every tool had to be tethered or held. Every body drifted when it should have braced. Morrow, who had spent 18 months on a low-gravity construction rig in the asteroid belt before joining the Corps, moved through the near-weightlessness with practiced ease. The Cathara juniors, who had never trained in reduced gravity because their species considered gravity failure scenarios too improbable to warrant drill time, clung to wall brackets and pipe fittings, their segmented legs splayed for stability, their mandibles working in rapid patterns that needed no translation. Fear, confusion, determination. Chen anchored himself to a structural beam with his belt clip and served as a fixed point that both humans and Cathara could push against, brace against, return to when the floating disoriented them. They closed the valve by working in relay. One person held the tool while two others held the person holding the tool, and the last two held the wall panel that kept trying to drift into the workspace. It was absurd. It was the most effective teamwork Rourke had ever heard described over a comm channel. At valve 14, the last one, Okafor closed it with one hand while reading structural load data on his tablet with the other, because even as they finished the containment, the platform still needed someone paying attention to whether the structure around them would hold. The load data was borderline. The Tier 4 floor joists in the breach zone were carrying thermal stress loads that exceeded their rated capacity by 11%. Not enough to fail, enough to remember. Valve 14 closed, Okafor reported. All loop connections severed, but Rourke Tier 4's structural integrity is compromised in the breach zone. I'd recommend clearing all personnel from sections 4 Echo through 4 Hotel until we can do a proper assessment. Clear them, both species. Now. It took 8 minutes to evacuate the last Cathara workers from the compromised sections, guided through the maintenance crawlway by humans who had memorized the route during the night because Rourke had told them to map every exit, even the ones nobody used, even the ones that seemed unnecessary, even the ones sealed by a single hand-tightened bolt that a corporal named Vasquez had loosened at 1 in the morning, because he understood that preparation was not about the disaster you expected, but about the one detail you almost missed. The cascade was over, 24 minutes from first breach to last valve, 14 manual isolations, 12 humans, 7 Cathara juniors. One Cathara senior engineer who had been on the wrong side of history that morning and chose to be on the right side of it by afternoon. 0 fatalities. Rourke allowed herself to lean against the corridor wall for 10 seconds. Her left hand was a map of burns she hadn't looked at yet. Her hardsuit's thermal layer had held everywhere except the compromised gauntlet, which had performed well beyond its rated service life and would need to be replaced, had needed to be replaced 3 weeks ago, a fact she filed alongside every other deferred personal maintenance item that hadn't mattered as much as the platform. She breathed. The air inside her helmet tasted of sweat and the faint metallic tang of overworked scrubbers. She breathed again. Then she pushed off the wall, keyed the all-hands channel and said, "All stations, cascade contained. Begin damage assessment. I want eyes on every tier from 3 to 6. Human and Cathara teams pair up. Nobody works alone. Check in every 15 minutes. Rourke out." In the aftermath, the platform settled into the exhausted quiet of a structure that had nearly consumed itself. The emergency klaxon fell silent. The subsonic hum of Cathara communication, which had been running at elevated frequencies throughout the crisis, a species-wide stress response that made the air itself feel taut, gradually dropped back toward its baseline register. Emergency ventilation cycled cooler air through the compromised tiers, and the acrid smell of burnt alloy and vaporized coolant began to dissipate, replaced by the clean, filtered air of the upper tiers flowing downward through the atmospheric systems that Kim had rerouted during the event. Damage assessment teams formed without anyone issuing an order, mixed Cathara and human, organized without formal authority by people who had just spent 2 hours saving each other's lives. The teams moved through the affected sections in pairs, one human with tools and sensors, one Cathara with knowledge of the systems, and the structural vocabulary to identify damage that instruments might miss. Nobody questioned the pairing. Nobody filed a request for cross-species task allocation. The emergency had burned away the institutional boundary between contracted workers and crew, and what was left underneath was something simpler and older, people who had survived together, assessing what they'd saved together. Rourke walked the assessment personally, despite Dehar's suggestion that she report to the medical station for treatment of her hand. "It's a burn, Pavin. It'll keep. The platform won't." She walked every section she could reach on tiers 3 through 5, cataloging damage with the same methodical attention she'd given to pressure gauges every morning for 11 months. The difference was that now, when she marked a finding and flagged it for follow-up, the Cathara engineers in the adjacent sections came to look. They stood beside her, their compound eyes tracking the same reading she was tracking, their mandibles moving in patterns that were no longer dismissive but something closer to attentive. One senior engineer, the same one who had braced the wall panel for Driscoll at valve 12, followed Rourke for 3 full sections, saying nothing, watching everything, as if learning a language it had been refusing to study. The numbers came in over the next 6 hours. Containment cells breached 3, cells compromised but held 2, cells saved by manual intervention 22, total Cathara casualties 0, total human casualties 0, injuries, Brennan's burned hand wrapped in a thermal dressing and ignored. Rourke's degraded gauntlet seal that had resulted in first and second-degree burns across her left palm and the backs of 3 fingers. 2 Cathara engineers with exoskeletal stress fractures from operating in thermal environments beyond their species' tolerance. 1 Cathara junior, Keith Rassal, with thoracic bruising from being pinned under shifted wall plating freed by Akafor, who had lifted the plating alone because the nearest Cathara was too broad-shouldered to reach the access point. And the unnamed Cathara engineer at valve 10, whose cracked hands would require 3 weeks of exoskeletal regeneration therapy. No one died. 352 beings on a platform that had tried to consume itself, and every single one of them walked away. The 47 workers in Section 3 Foxtrot were released when atmospheric conditions stabilized 4 hours after the cascade ended, breathing human-standard air with no lasting effects, beyond mild respiratory discomfort that their medical staff attributed to the unfamiliar gas ratios and treated with supplemental breathing compounds. The Cathara engineer at valve 10, the one who had been trying to close valves with bare chitin hands for 20 minutes before any human arrived, was treated in the Cathara medical bay. The medics who examined the engineer's cracked hands found that the exoskeletal damage was extensive but healable. They also found, embedded in the fracture lines, traces of the thermal compound from the valve stems, proof that the engineer had kept working long after the pain should have been unbearable, kept gripping warped metal with hands that were splitting apart, kept trying because the alternative was giving up, and Cathara engineers did not give up. Neither did human ones. That was the part nobody had expected them to have in common. Patel's thermal models, when compared against the actual cascade data, proved accurate to within 4%. Scenario 7. Loop-fed cascade with secondary system propagation. The intervention window had been 26 minutes. They had used 24, 2 minutes of margin. The entire platform had survived on 2 minutes of margin, and the fact that 12 humans had spent a night building things they weren't asked to build and walking routes they weren't authorized to walk. On a platform designed by 900 years of Cathara expertise, running extraction systems built to triple redundant standards, using protocols certified by the Guild's most senior engineers, on a platform where every fail-safe had been calculated, and every human opinion had been dismissed, no one died because 12 humans had spent a day preparing for a disaster they'd been told couldn't happen, and then walked into it when it did. Rourke sat in the human mess at 1400, her left hand wrapped in a burn dressing, her hardsuit stacked in the corner with its degraded gauntlet visible as a darkened, wrinkled patch on the wrist. She was eating the first meal she'd had in 18 hours, reconstituted noodles, tasteless, perfect, when the hatch opened and Soveth Ka entered. The Kethara director had never entered the human quarters. In 11 months, no Kethara above junior technician rank had set foot in the human section. It was not prohibited. It was simply unthinkable the way a factory supervisor might never visit the closet where the mops were stored. Not forbidden, just beneath notice. Soveth Ka stood in the hatchway. The director's amber exoskeleton was dull, heat-stressed, cracked along the shoulder joints where the thermal load had exceeded even the Kethara's natural tolerance. The compound eyes moved across the small mess space, the 12 chairs, the single table, the equipment lockers along the wall, the personal effects. Rourke's framed photograph of Lake Huron, Dehar's prayer beads hanging from a hook, Brennan's dented coffee thermos. The director's mandibles moved. The translator rendered it as, the Cascade would have reached the Tier 3 containment bank within 40 minutes of the initial breach, based on the loop propagation rate documented during the event. The Tier 3 bank holds the platform's primary power store. A breach of the primary power store would have resulted in a structural failure event, affecting all 9 tiers. Rourke set down her fork. 352 individuals occupy this platform, Soveth Ka continued. 340 Kethara, 12 humans. The structural failure event projected for the Tier 3 breach would have been non-survivable for all occupants. Yes, Rourke said. You identified the failure conditions 11 days before the event. You reported them through proper channels. Your reports were acknowledged and not acted upon. Yes. You then prepared contingency measures without authorization, using human equipment and human techniques, in sections of the platform you were not assigned to maintain. Yes. Soveth Ka's palps moved in a pattern Rourke had never seen, slow, deliberate, as if the director were choosing each vibration with the care of someone selecting words in a language they were only now learning to speak honestly. Why? Not why did you exceed your authority, not why did you violate protocol, one word, why? Rourke looked at the Kethara director, at the dull, cracked exoskeleton, at the compound eyes that had looked through her for 11 months, at the mandibles that had dismissed her reports with a click and a noted, at the body that stood in her doorway now with a stillness that was not authority but something else entirely, something that cost more. Because you were on my ship, Rourke said, all of you, I don't know how to do this halfway. Soveth Ka's mandibles stopped moving. The compound eyes held steady on Rourke's face. The subsonic hum that filled every Kethara interaction, the background vibration of their social communication, ever-present, involuntary, went silent. For the first time in Rourke's 11 months on the station, a Kethara stood in her presence without making a sound. The silence lasted 8 seconds. Then Soveth Ka did something that the Kethara social archives would later record as unprecedented in 900 years of guild operations. The director's 6 limbs folded, not the efficient crouch of a Kethara sitting, but a slow, deliberate lowering that brought the director's compound eyes below the level of Rourke's. In Kethara hierarchy, elevation determined authority. The highest eyes commanded, the lowest served. For a guild director to lower their eyes below a contracted maintenance worker was not submission. It was something the Kethara language had a word for, but rarely used a word the translator struggled with for 11 seconds before rendering it as correction of a profound error, offered without defense. Rourke sat very still. Soveth Ka spoke from that lowered position. The guild dispatched a distress signal when the cascade began. The Galactic Trade Authority responded. They have sent an emergency stabilization convoy, 4 engineering vessels, 2 supply transports, a medical frigate, and a heavy structural platform for containment rebuild. Estimated arrival, 14 hours. That's good. The platform needs the rebuild capacity. The convoy's engineering assessment will find that the cascade was contained by manual isolation of 14 loop connections, performed under extreme thermal conditions, using techniques not present in any Cathara engineering manual. They will find that the work was done by 12 contracted human damage control technicians who had been told, repeatedly, that their engineering opinions were not required. Rourke said nothing. They will also find that one of those technicians identified the failure conditions 11 days before the event and was dismissed. Soveth Ka's palps moved once. By me. Director. The convoy will arrive in 14 hours. When it does, I will submit a full incident report to the Guild Council. The report will include your 11 pressure logs, your coolant seepage flag, your request for an emergency engineering review, and my response to each. I will not alter the record. I will not soften it. The Guild will see what I did and what you did, and the Council will draw its own conclusions. Soveth Ka rose, slowly. The compound eyes came back to level with Rourke's, then above, and the director stood at full height, taller than any human, encased in amber chitin, mandibles still. In 900 years of Guild operations, no contracted species has ever been credited with saving a platform. The Guild archives do not have a category for it. A pause. They will have to create one. The director turned and walked toward the hatch. At the threshold, Soveth Ka stopped. The mandibles moved, but no sound came through the translator. The palps vibrated at a frequency Rourke's ears couldn't detect, but her chest could feel a deep, sustained pulse that resonated in her sternum and made the air in the small mess hall feel heavier, warmer, closer. It lasted 4 seconds. Later, when the xenolinguists at the Terran Cultural Institute analyzed the palp vibration recording from Rourke's suit microphone, they identified it as a Cathara social harmonic reserved for moments of institutional significance. The closest approximation, delivered with the standard academic caveats about cross-species emotional mapping, was, "I was wrong, and the wrongness is mine, and I will carry it." Soveth Ka left without looking back. The hatch closed behind the director, and the subsonic vibration faded from the air, and Rourke sat alone in the human mess with her burned hand throbbing and her noodles cold. She picked up her fork, put it down, picked up her datapad instead, and opened a new log entry. She stared at the blank screen for a long time. Then she typed, Day 12, all stations nominal, pressure gauge on bulkhead 9 requires replacement. Recommend full secondary cooling loop inspection, all tiers, all Cathara crew accounted for, all human crew accounted for, no casualties at all. She saved it, sent it, and for the first time in 11 months, the acknowledgement that came back was not a single administrative character. It was the Cathara script for received and understood. In the hours that followed, something changed on the Anishval platform. It happened quietly, without announcement or ceremony, in the way that real changes happen not in speeches, but in small alterations to the pattern of daily life. A Cathara junior engineer appeared at the human workshop on Tier 2 and Brennan asked, not instructed, whether the portable containment barriers could be made in larger quantities for permanent storage. Brennan said yes. The engineer stayed for 3 hours, learning the fabrication process, its chitinous hands handling the composite sheeting with a delicacy that surprised Brennan, until he realized that the Cathara's grip sensitivity, the same sensitivity that had failed them on the warped valve stems, made the junior engineer extraordinarily precise with thin materials. They built 2 barriers together. Neither of them said much. They didn't need to. On Tier 4, mixed human Cathara teams worked the damage assessment side by side. No authorization forms were filed. No protocol amendments were issued. The Cathara simply started including the humans in their work rotations, and the humans started including the Cathara in their briefings, and the boundary that had separated them for 11 months became, in the space of a single day, something that neither side could quite remember the reason for. Dihar noticed it first. "They're bringing us their maintenance logs," he told Rourke that evening. "3 junior engineers came to me today with gauge readings from tiers 5 and 6. They wanted to know if I saw anything in the data they should worry about." "What did you tell them?" "I told them tier 5 looks clean, but there's a coupling on tier 6 that I'd like to inspect in person." He paused. "They offered to take me down there tomorrow." "Go." 14 hours after the cascade ended, the Trade Authority convoy arrived. 4 engineering vessels, 2 supply transports, a medical frigate, and a heavy structural platform, the full emergency response package, clean and enormous against the backdrop of the damaged station. The convoy's lead vessel docked at the platform's primary port, and 32 Guild-certified engineers and 14 medical specialists came aboard in an organized deployment that reflected 900 years of institutional emergency response. They were efficient. They were thorough. They were, by any standard, exactly the right resources arriving at exactly the right time. 14 hours too late. The convoy's senior engineer, a Cathara Guild master named Torvathan, conducted a 72-hour assessment of the platform, the cascade event, and the containment response. Torvathan was old by Cathara standards. Its exoskeleton bore the layered patina of decades, each molt leaving a slightly different shade of amber, so that the Guild Master's chitin was a map of its own history, dark at the base where youth had laid the foundation, lighter at the surface where age had refined it. Its compound eyes moved across the damage with the patient precision of someone who had seen 100 platforms and understood, with the clarity of long experience, exactly what it meant when the systems designed to prevent disaster had become the pathway for it. The assessment report ran to 411 pages. It detailed every failure point, every design assumption that had proved wrong, every redundancy that hadn't performed. It mapped the cascade's propagation path and confirmed that without the manual loop isolation performed by the human team, the cascade would have reached the Tier 3 power store in approximately 38 minutes, resulting in total structural failure and the loss of all 352 lives aboard. Page 409 contained a single recommendation, set apart from the technical findings in a block reserved for matters of institutional significance. The Cathara Extraction Guild's 900-year operating protocol does not include a provision for crediting contracted non-Cathara personnel with critical platform preservation. This omission is not an oversight. It is an assumption, the assumption that non-Cathara species lack the engineering judgment to contribute at the critical tier. This assumption has been tested and found incorrect. The protocol should be amended. Page 410 listed the names of the 12 humans. First on the list, Chief Damage Control Officer Tessa Rourke, Terran Merchant Engineering Corps. Page 411, the final page, was blank except for a single notation in the Cathara ceremonial script, a form of writing reserved for guild records of permanent institutional significance. The translator rendered it as, "Let it be remembered that on this day, the ones we did not listen to were the ones who stayed." The notation carried no author's name. In the Cathara Guild tradition, ceremonial script belongs to the institution as a whole, because the acknowledgement and the shame are collective. Torvathan, the guild master who wrote the assessment, was asked by the Terran Press Corps what had impressed him most about the human team's performance during the cascade. The guild master considered the question for a long time, so long that the translator's idle tone hummed twice before the answer came. "They prepared," Torvathan said. "They identified the failure, they reported it, they were dismissed, and then they prepared anyway through the night in silence, without authorization, without recognition, without any assurance that the preparation would ever be needed. That is what impressed me, not the valves, not the thermal bridge, not the atmospheric rerouting. the preparation. The decision to spend a night building things nobody asked for, on the possibility that those things might save people who had never thanked them for anything. 2 weeks after the convoy's arrival, Rourke received a formal communication from the Cathara Extraction Guild's Central Council. It was written in the Guild's official diplomatic register, the first time that register had been used to address a non-Cathara individual. The communication offered Rourke and her team permanent advisory status within the Guild's engineering hierarchy, a position that had never existed before, and that carried with it the right to review, comment on, and flag concerns about any extraction platform's operating parameters without prior authorization. The right, in other words, to be listened to. Rourke accepted on behalf of her team. She filed the acceptance document in the same log where she'd filed 11 pressure gauge reports and 1 coolant seepage flag. She did not frame it. She did not celebrate it. She added it to the record and moved on to the next day's inspection round, the same way she had moved through every morning for 11 months, the same route, the same gauges, the same methodical attention to systems that most people forgot existed until they failed. The difference now was that when she passed a Cathara work team on Tier 4, they stopped, not to stare, not to dismiss. They stopped, and one of them, always the youngest, always the one with the least institutional conditioning, would dip its head in the small, fast gesture that Towsing had first received at the pressure boundary during the cascade. A gesture that was spreading through the Cathara crew the way the cascade had spread through the containment cells, except this propagation built something instead of destroying it. When interviewers from the Terran press asked about the incident in the months and years that followed, she gave the same answer every time, in the same flat, unhurried voice she used for everything from pressure gauge readings to cascade containment. We were there. The platform needed work. We did the work. She never mentioned the 11 reports. She never mentioned the dismissals. She never mentioned Soveth Ka by name or described the director's unprecedented lowering gesture. Those details belonged to the people who had lived them, not to audiences who would turn them into narrative. Rourke had no interest in being a story. She had interest in the platform running correctly, and in the people aboard it, all of them, regardless of species, going home alive at the end of their contracts. But on the Anishval platform, in the human mess hall on Tier 2, someone nobody ever confirmed who welded a small bracket to the wall above the table where Rourke had been eating her cold noodles when Soveth Ka walked in. And on the bracket sat a piece of warped valve stem from Bulkhead 9, Cross Gallery 7, Extraction Tier 4, the valve that had started everything, the valve that had ended it. Beneath it, etched in both Cathara ceremonial script and standard English, 4 words. She told us 11 times. Nobody took credit for the welding. Nobody took credit for the inscription. When Rourke asked, her crew shrugged. Brennan said he'd been asleep. Dihar said he'd been meditating. Akafar said he'd been running structural checks, and Patel said she didn't know what they were talking about, which was a lie because the welding technique was recognizably hers. The bracket stayed. Rourke stopped asking. The bracket was never removed. When the Anishval platform was eventually decommissioned 41 years later, its extraction reserves depleted, its structure honorably retired after 4 decades of continuous operation, the valve and its inscription were transferred to the Cathara Extraction Guild's Central Archive on their homeworld. It sits there today, in a display case on the archive's ground floor, beside 900 years of engineering achievements and the tools and mechanisms that built an industrial civilization. Beside crystalline instruments of precision that took generations to develop. Beside alloys that the Cathara had engineered to tolerances that human metallurgy was still working to match. Beside the accumulated evidence of a species that had mastered deep pressure extraction before humans had mastered fire. It is the only artifact in the archive that was not made by Cathara hands, and it is the only one that visitors stop to read.